By December 1944, the world believed Nazi Germany was broken. American soldiers on the quiet Ghost Front were already dreaming of Christmas, assured by their commanders that the enemy had neither the fuel nor the will to launch another major attack. They were wrong. Deep within the freezing fog of the Ardennes forest, Hitler had secretly assembled a massive armored force for one final, desperate gamble to break the Allied alliance. The coming storm would shatter the silence of the winter and set the stage for a single, impossible military decision that would defy the laws of war. To understand the gravity of that single question and the impossible answer that was about to follow, we must rewind the clock 10 days and step away from the panic of Verdun into the quiet, methodical atmosphere of Nancy, France. It is December 9th, 1944, and to the rest of the world, the Third Reich appears to be in its death throes, a battered boxer reeling against the ropes, waiting for the final knockout blow. Allied intelligence reports were flooding Supreme Headquarters with optimistic assessments, painting a picture of a German army that was exhausted, demoralized, and incapable of mounting anything more than a desperate local defense. The general consensus among the high command was that the war was effectively won, that the German war machine had been ground down to a skeleton crew of old men and boys, lacking the fuel, the ammunition, and the will to launch a major offensive. The Ardennes sector, a rugged region of dense forests and deep ravines, was considered a ghost front, a quiet zone where battered American divisions went to rest and green units went to get their first taste of trench life. But in the headquarters of General George S. Patton's Third Army, one man was not celebrating the impending victory. Colonel Oscar Koch was not a man given to theatrics or wishful thinking. He was the G2, the intelligence chief for Patton, and he lived in a world of cold, hard data. While other intelligence officers were writing victory parades in their minds, Koch was staring at a map of the Western Front and seeing a nightmare taking shape in the negative space. He had spent weeks meticulously tracking the movement of German units, logging radio traffic, analyzing prisoner interrogations, and studying aerial reconnaissance photos with the obsession of a forensic detective hunting a serial killer. He had noticed something that everyone else had missed, or perhaps something that everyone else had chosen to ignore because it terrified them. 15 German divisions had simply vanished. These were not broken infantry regiments or second-rate garrison troops. These were full-strength Panzer divisions, the elite armored fist of the Wehrmacht, equipped with hundreds of Tiger and Panther tanks. You do not simply lose 15 divisions in modern warfare unless someone is going to great lengths to hide them. Koch walked into Patton's office on that gray December morning, his arms laden with dossiers, maps, and intercepted signals, carrying the weight of a truth that contradicted every optimistic report coming from London and Washington. He laid the evidence out on the general's desk, a mosaic of danger that formed a distinct and terrifying pattern. He pointed to the rail lines inside Germany, showing a massive increase in nighttime traffic moving west. Trains loaded with heavy equipment running under the cover of darkness to avoid Allied fighter bombers. He pointed to the radio silence that had fallen over the 6th Panzer Army, a discipline that suggested a major operation was being prepared in absolute secrecy. Most disturbingly, he pointed to the Ardennes, the quiet sector where American lines were stretched dangerously thin, held by troops who believed they were on vacation. Koch argued that the Germans were not retreating. They were coiling, gathering their strength for a massive counterstroke designed to split the Allied armies in two. Patton listened. He was a man known for his flamboyance, his pearl-handled revolvers, and his aggressive speeches. But behind the bluster lay a sharp, professional military mind that respected competence above all else. He trusted Koch because Koch had been right when others were wrong in North Africa and Sicily. As the intelligence officer outlined the scenario, a massive German thrust through the Ardennes aimed at the Meuse River in the port of Antwerp, Patton did not dismiss it as pessimism. He saw the logic in the madness. If Hitler wanted to turn the tide of the war, he had to strike now. In the winter, when the Allied air forces would be grounded by bad weather, striking at the weakest point in the line. While General Omar Bradley and the staff at SHAEF dismissed the idea of a German offensive as operationally insane, given the terrain and the weather, Patton looked at the map and saw the trap. "If you are right," Patton asked, his voice low and serious, "when do they attack?" Koch did not hesitate, his answer born from the rhythmic cycles of troop movements and logistical buildups he had been tracking for months. He estimated that the enemy would be ready to strike within 2 weeks, likely timing their assault to coincide with a predicted period of heavy fog and storms that would neutralize American air superiority. This was the moment that defined the Battle of the Bulge before a single shot was fired. Patton did not wait for permission from Eisenhower. He did not wait for confirmation from the Germans. He picked up the phone and called his staff, initiating a level of operational planning that bordered on clairvoyance. He ordered his planners to draft 3 separate contingency plans, codenamed for the possible directions the Third Army might have to pivot. The planning effort that began in Nancy was a logistical symphony conducted in secret, a feverish preparation for a crisis that had not yet happened. While the rest of the Allied armies were focused on pushing east into the Saar, thinking only of crossing the Rhine, Patton's staff was figuring out how to stop that eastward momentum, turn 90 degrees to the north, and drive into the flank of a theoretical German breakthrough. They mapped out road networks that were currently clogged with snow and ice, calculating fuel consumption for thousands of tanks and trucks, designating assembly areas, and identifying supply dumps. This was the unglamorous, grinding work of war, the mathematics of movement that wins battles before the infantry ever fixes bayonets. They were preparing to move 250,000 men across the face of an enemy front in the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. Then the hammer fell. At 5:30 in the morning, on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered by the thunder of 2,000 German guns opening fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The earth shook as heavy artillery shells pulverized the forward positions of the American 106th Infantry Division and the 28th Infantry Division, units that had gone to sleep expecting another quiet day of patrol duty. Following the barrage came the white-clad infantry, emerging from the fog like ghosts, and behind them, the roar of the Maybach engines of the Panzer divisions. The ghost front had come alive with a vengeance, and the surprise was total. American communication lines were severed in the first hour, command posts were overrun, and confusion reigned supreme as units found themselves isolated and surrounded in the freezing forests. Reports began to trickle into Supreme Headquarters, fragmented and panicked, speaking of Tiger tanks on roads where there should have been none, of paratroopers dropping behind the lines, of entire regiments disappearing from the map. At first, the Allied High Command tried to rationalize the chaos, dismissing the attack as a spoiling action or a local counterattack designed to relieve pressure on other fronts. It took hours, bleeding into days, for the reality to sink in. This was not a skirmish. It was a strategic offensive of massive proportions. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, were pouring through the gap in the lines, driving hard for the Meuse River. The 106th Infantry Division, green and overwhelmed, was disintegrating, with 2 of its regiments surrendering in what would become the largest mass capitulation of U.S. troops in the European theater. While panic began to ripple through the corridors of power in Versailles and Washington, the mood in Patton's headquarters was strikingly different. There was no chaos, no scrambling for maps, no desperate improvisation. When the news of the breakthrough was confirmed, Patton simply turned to Colonel Koch and nodded. "You were right," he said. "Now we play ball." The code phrase "play ball" was transmitted to the Third Army staff, unlocking the contingency plans that had been sitting in the safe for days. While other commanders were staring at their maps in horror, trying to figure out where the Germans were, Patton's staff already knew where they were going, and more importantly, how to hit them. The pre-planning allowed them to bypass the paralysis of analysis. They shifted from an offensive posture in the Saar to a rescue mission in the Ardennes with the flip of a switch. The logistical feat that followed was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to American industrial power and organizational genius. In the freezing cold, under a sky heavy with leaden clouds, the Third Army began to rotate. 133,000 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, deuce-and-a-half trucks, fuel bowsers, and ambulances began to pull out of the line and turn north. Military police, shivering at icy crossroads, directed traffic with ruthless efficiency, enforcing the strict timetables that Koch's planning had established. They were moving an entire city of men and machines over roads that were little more than glazed ice tracks, fighting against the friction of winter and the friction of war. But the situation in the north was deteriorating faster than the trucks could move. The vital crossroads town of Bastogne, the hub of the road network in the southern Ardennes, was in danger of being encircled. The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to the town in open trucks, racing the German Panzers to the prize. They arrived just in time to dig in before the steel trap snapped shut around them. Inside the perimeter, paratroopers huddled in foxholes dug into the frozen ground, low on ammunition, lacking winter clothing, and cut off from all support. They were an island of resistance in a sea of German armor, holding the line against repeated assaults. When the German commander demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave the famous one-word reply, "Nuts." It was a defiance that echoed around the world, but defiance alone cannot stop tanks. They needed relief, and they needed it immediately. This brings us back to the conference room in Verdun on December 19th. Eisenhower had called the meeting to organize a response to the crisis. But the mood was grim. The generals present knew the difficulty of maneuvering in winter. They knew the exhaustion of their troops. They knew the terrifying strength of the German reserves that had just been unleashed. Eisenhower looked at Patton, the man he often found exasperating, but whose fighting spirit he never doubted. He needed a miracle. He needed a counterattack to hit the southern flank of the German Bulge, to relieve Bastogne and cut off the enemy spearheads. But military doctrine dictated that disengaging an army and moving it into a new attack vector took weeks. Eisenhower hoped Patton could do it in maybe 4 or 5 days. When Eisenhower asked, "How soon can you attack?" the room went silent. Commanders looked at their boots or shuffled papers, afraid to promise what they couldn't deliver. Then Patton stood up. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't consult with a frantic staff aide whispering in his ear. He looked straight at the Supreme Commander. "I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours, he declared. The reaction was immediate and incredulous. Some officers chuckled nervously, thinking it was typical Patton bluster, a boast made for effect. Others looked angry, feeling that Patton was trivializing the immense logistical nightmare they were all facing. 48 hours? It was impossible. It was physically impossible to move that many men that far, that fast, and launch a coordinated assault into the teeth of a German panzer army. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He wasn't guessing. He was the only man in the room who had the paperwork already done. He explained that he had 3 divisions already handpicked for the job: the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry. He explained that his supply dumps had already been repositioned, his communications nets rewired, his artillery plotted. He told Eisenhower that his staff had been working on this exact scenario since Koch had spotted the missing divisions in early December. The disbelief in the room slowly turned to a dawning realization. Patton was not reacting to the German offensive. He was springing a trap he had set for it. Eisenhower, his face relaxing for the first time in days, smiled. "Start fighting, George," he said. Patton walked out of that meeting room and unleashed a whirlwind. He grabbed a telephone and uttered the code words that set the massive gears of the Third Army into high speed. Within hours, the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of the relief force, was tearing up the roads toward Bastogne. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, faces wrapped in scarves against the biting wind, urging their drivers to push the Shermans to their limits. They drove through blizzards that reduced visibility to 0, past retreating columns of demoralized troops who stared in shock at the tanks rushing toward the sound of the guns. This was not just an army on the move. It was a force of nature, driven by the will of a commander who had refused to be surprised. The race for Bastogne was on, a desperate sprint against time where every hour lost meant more dead paratroopers in the snow. The movement of the Third Army that began on the night of December 19th was not merely a military maneuver. It was a defiance of physics, a logistical ballet performed on a stage of black ice and frozen mud. While the rest of the Allied front was reeling in shock, paralyzed by the violence of the German onslaught, Patton's columns were a river of steel flowing north against the grain of the blizzard. The roads were treacherous ribbons of glazed asphalt, slick with sleet, where a single skid could send a 30-ton Sherman tank sliding uncontrollably into a ditch, blocking the entire advance for hours. Military police, their faces wrapped in wool scarves until only their eyes were visible, stood at the critical intersections like statues of ice, waving the columns through with frantic urgency, prioritizing the combat elements while ruthlessly shoving supply trucks to the shoulders. They were moving an entire Army Corps, 3 divisions, over 100,000 men, and thousands of vehicles, 90 degrees to the north, cutting across the lines of communication of the rest of the army, a feat that German planners had mathematically determined was impossible in under a week. Inside the turrets of the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division, commanders fought a battle against two enemies, the Germans waiting in the tree lines and the exhaustion that threatened to close their eyes. They drove with their hatches open, exposing themselves to the biting wind and the spray of freezing slush. Because to close the hatch was to lose situational awareness in the blinding whiteout of the snow squalls. The roar of the engines was a constant, deafening drone, vibrating through the bones of the crewmen, masking the sound of distant artillery that marked the location of the beleaguered town of Bastogne. They were driving into a salient, a bulge in the line where the rules of the front had disintegrated into a chaotic brawl of meeting engagements and ambushes. Every village was a potential fortress, every patch of dark forest a potential tank trap, yet the order from Patton was unequivocal. Drive, drive, drive. Do not stop for sleep. Do not stop for food. Do not stop until you see the paratroopers. While the relief force battered its way north, the situation inside the perimeter of Bastogne had descended into a medieval siege fought with modern weapons. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored and remnants of other units, had formed a tight circular defensive perimeter around the town, a hedgehog of resistance that the German waves broke against but could not wash away. The conditions inside the pocket were appalling. The temperature had plummeted to near zero, freezing the ground so hard that digging a foxhole required explosives or superhuman effort, leaving men to cower in shallow scrapes, scraped from the frozen earth. Artillery shells rained down incessantly, turning the snow gray with pulverized stone and dirt, while the thick, low-hanging fog grounded the Allied Air Force, preventing aerial resupply or close air support. Ammunition was rationed to a few rounds per man per day. Food stocks were dwindling to critical levels, and the field hospitals were overflowing with wounded men who were freezing to death because there were no blankets and no heat. The German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, believing that the American situation was hopeless, sent a party of 4 emissaries under a white flag to the American lines on December 22nd, carrying a written demand for surrender to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st, who was trying to grab a few minutes of sleep in his underground headquarters. When awakened and told of the demand, McAuliffe, groggy and frustrated, muttered, "Aw, nuts." After some discussion with his staff on how to draft a formal diplomatic reply that conveyed his sentiment, they decided that his initial reaction was the best one. The typed response, centered on a single sheet of paper, read simply, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander," a refusal to acknowledge the tactical reality that they were surrounded, outgunned, and outnumbered. But morale, no matter how high, cannot stop a Tiger tank, and the Germans were tightening the noose. On Christmas Eve, the Luftwaffe launched heavy bombing raids on the town, reducing buildings to rubble and killing civilians and soldiers alike in the cellars, while German armor probed the perimeter, looking for a weak spot to crack the nut. Patton, monitoring the progress of his relief column from his headquarters in Luxembourg, was consumed by a restless, ferocious energy, pacing the floor and cursing the weather that blinded his air power. He famously called for his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, and ordered him to write a prayer for good weather, demanding that the Lord grant him clear skies to kill Germans. Whether by divine intervention or meteorological chance, the skies cleared the following day, unleashing the full fury of the Allied tactical air forces. P-47 Thunderbolts dropped from the sky like avenging angels, strafing German columns and blasting tanks that had been exposed against the white snow, while C-47 transport planes filled the sky over Bastogne with hundreds of colored parachutes, dropping tons of ammunition and medical supplies to the cheering paratroopers below. With the skies clear and the ground support pounding the German flanks, the 4th Armored Division accelerated its assault, pushing aside German resistance with a violence born of desperation. The leading unit, Combat Command R, commanded by the aggressive Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a man whose name would later adorn the modern American main battle tank, was the tip of Patton's spear. Abrams did not believe in cautious advances. He believed in violence of action, in using the shock and speed of his tanks to overwhelm the enemy before they could set their defenses. On December 26, 4 miles from Bastogne, his column ran into a strong German blocking force in the village of Assenois. The Germans had mined the road and positioned anti-tank guns in the cellars of the stone houses, creating a lethal gauntlet that had to be run. Abrams didn't hesitate. He ordered a bombardment of the village by his own artillery, and then, in a move that defied all safety regulations, ordered his tanks to charge into the village while the shells were still falling. It was a gamble that relied on the armor of the tanks to protect them from the shrapnel of their own guns, catching the German defenders with their heads down. The American Shermans roared into Assenois, their tracks churning up the snow, their machine guns hosing down every window and doorway, crushing the German resistance under the sheer weight of their momentum. They drove through the smoke and the fire, bursting out the other side of the village and racing up the road toward the perimeter of Bastogne, where the paratroopers were waiting. At 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, the lead tank, a Sherman jumbo named Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, spotted the foxholes of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Bogus, unsure if the figures in the distance were friends or foes in the fading light, called out, and a paratrooper lifted his head from the snow and waved. The link was established. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The 48-hour promise that Patton had made in Verdun, the promise that the other generals had scoffed at, had been fulfilled, albeit a few days late due to the weather and the ferocity of the fighting. But the strategic effect was exactly what Patton had predicted. The German offensive had been blunted, its momentum stalled, and its southern flank smashed by the hammer of the Third Army. The relief of Bastogne was the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge, the moment where the German initiative collapsed and the slow, grinding process of their destruction began. But the cost of the victory was etched into the landscape, a frozen tableau of horror that shocked even the most hardened veterans. The forests around Bastogne were shattered. The trees snapped like matchsticks by artillery fire, their branches draped with the frozen bodies of paratroopers and Panzer grenadiers who had fought to the death in the snow. The roads were graveyards of burnt-out metal, lined with the husks of Sherman tanks and Panther tanks, their crews entombed inside the steel coffins. It was a victory won not just by strategy, but by the endurance of men who had lived in holes in the ground at 20 degrees below zero, fighting off frostbite and fear with nothing but a rifle and a few rounds of ammunition. While the soldiers celebrated the breaking of the siege, the intelligence officers at SHAEF were quietly conducting an autopsy of their failure. How had they been so wrong? How had the ghost front erupted with such surprise? The answer led them back to the quiet, bespectacled man in Nancy, Colonel Oscar Koch, and his meticulous, unglamorous work. The other intelligence agencies had looked at the German army and seen what they wanted to see: a defeated enemy. Koch had looked at the German army and seen what was actually there: a wounded animal preparing to bite. He had tracked the rail schedules, the fuel depots, the movement of individual units, building a mosaic of truth out of thousands of tiny fragments of data. He had not relied on intuition or hope. He had relied on the cold, hard facts, and he had possessed the moral courage to present those facts to a commander who was willing to listen. The relationship between Patton and Koch was the secret weapon of the Third Army, a symbiosis of fire and ice that allowed them to achieve the impossible. Patton provided the will, the aggression, and the leadership. Koch provided the eyes, the brain, and the warning. Without Koch's warning, Patton would have been deep in the Saar when the attack came, his army entangled in a different fight, unable to disengage in time to save Bastogne. Without Patton's trust, Koch's intelligence would have been just another ignored report gathering dust in a file cabinet, a Cassandra warning that history would have noted only with tragic irony. Together they demonstrated that the greatest tool in warfare is not the tank or the airplane, but the prepared mind. As January 1945 wore on, the Allies slowly pushed the Germans back, erasing the Bulge from the map and grinding the last reserves of the Wehrmacht into the mud. The German army would never attack again. They had spent their last chips on a gamble that failed because one American general had read their bluff. The war would continue for another 5 months, a bloody slog across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Third Army continued its drive, slashing across Germany with the same speed and aggression that had saved Bastogne, guided always by the quiet, accurate assessments of Colonel Koch. In the years following the war, the legend of George Patton grew to mythic proportions, fueled by movies and books that celebrated his brash personality and his tactical genius. He became the symbol of American military aggression, the old blood and guts who slapped soldiers and pissed in the Rhine. But the story of his greatest triumph, the relief of Bastogne, is incomplete without the story of Oscar Koch. It is a reminder that behind every great man of action, there is often a quiet man of thought, a professional who does the homework, checks the math, and prepares the plan that makes the miracle possible. History tends to remember the roar of the cannon, but it often forgets the man who calculated the trajectory. The lesson of December 1944 echoes down through the decades to military academies and war rooms around the world today. It teaches us that assumptions are the enemy of intelligence, that hope is not a strategy, and that the most dangerous time in any conflict is the moment you think you have already won. The Ghost Front was not quiet because the enemy was gone. It was quiet because the enemy was holding its breath. Oscar Koch heard that silence and understood what it meant. He didn't have a crystal ball. He had a map, a pencil, and a refusal to lie to himself or his commander. So when we look back at the black and white footage of the tanks rolling through the snow, at the tired faces of the paratroopers in Bastogne, and at the generals huddled over their maps in Verdun, we should remember that the difference between victory and defeat often hangs on a single thread of information. We should remember the 11 days of secret preparation that allowed an army to turn on a dime. And we should remember that while George Patton was the architect of the impossible, Oscar Koch was the man who surveyed the land and laid the foundation. In the end, the savior of Bastogne was not just the courage of the soldier or the armor of the tank, but the simple, unglamorous power of the truth. General Patton is often remembered for his aggression and ego, but this story highlights his preparation and trust in his staff. Do you think the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge would have been different if Patton hadn't trusted Colonel Koch's intelligence when everyone else ignored it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.